The sound of gravel crunching under tires was the only warning I got before my truck came to a dead stop in front of a massive metal gate. Except it wasn't my gate, it was a barricade someone had dragged right across my driveway. I killed the engine and stared at it, blinking through the rain. It was one of those construction site gates, the kind with chain link panels and concrete feet. And behind it, smug under a yellow poncho and holding a clipboard like it was a sword, stood none other than Gloria Zimmerman, our HOA president and full-time menace. I stepped out of the truck into the downpour. "Gloria, what the hell is this?" She didn't even flinch. "You're in violation of Article 7, Section 4, no external construction without prior HOA approval." I laughed, rain dripping off my cap. "Gloria, it's a workshop in my backyard. On my own property, I've got permits from the city." She tapped the clipboard. "Permits don't override HOA guidelines, Franklin. You should have waited for board review." I stared at her. "You're not the city. You're a retired dental hygienist who thinks she runs a tiny dictatorship." "I'm enforcing the rules," she snapped. "And until this construction is halted and reviewed, that gate stays." I looked past her at the frame of the workshop being built, my dream project, months in the making. The crew had just started this morning. Materials were delivered. Rain or not, they were ready to work. Now they were just standing there watching us from behind the fence like this was some kind of soap opera. "You know this is illegal, right?" I said, stepping closer. "Blocking someone's driveway, that's trespassing," she sniffed. "I'm not on your property. The gate is technically on the easement." I pulled out my phone. "We'll let the sheriff sort that out." Her smile faltered. "You wouldn't." I already had the sheriff's office on speed dial. "Watch me." It took them 20 minutes to arrive. By then, the rain had picked up and Gloria's poncho was clinging to her like a wet grocery bag. Deputy Carson, a guy I'd known since high school, stepped out of the cruiser and took one look at the scene. "You gotta be kidding me," he muttered. "She's blocking my construction site," I said. "She dragged that gate across my driveway." Gloria held up her clipboard like it was a badge. "This is an HOA enforcement action." Deputy Carson raised an eyebrow. "This isn't an HOA matter. Blocking someone's driveway is interference with property access. That's a civil issue, maybe criminal depending on intent." Gloria scoffed. "You're siding with him?" "I'm siding with the law," he replied. "And you're gonna move that gate now, in this rain." He crossed his arms. "Yup. By hand, since you dragged it here that way. You can't be serious. I can also call for a tow truck and file a report for property obstruction. Your choice." She looked at me. I didn't say a word, just stood there, arms crossed, while the rain poured harder. With a grunt, she stomped through the mud and started dragging the gate back off my driveway, one angry inch at a time. The crew clapped. I didn't stop them. Gloria slipped twice, cursed louder each time, and when the last panel was clear, she spun around and shouted, "This isn't over, Franklin." I gave her a thumbs up. "See you at the next HOA meeting, Madam President." She stormed off, dripping and defeated. But something told me this was just the opening round. HOA story, HOA stories, homeowners association stories. By the time the sheriff left, the crew had already started hauling wood and tools back onto the site. I gave them the go-ahead to resume work, but part of me knew I'd be dealing with more than just hammering and sawdust in the days ahead. Gloria never lost quietly. She relished power like some people did coffee, hot, bitter, and every morning without fail. 2 days later, I got the letter. It was slid under my front door sometime before dawn. No postage, no envelope, just a folded sheet of HOA letterhead with a typed cease and desist notice, threatening daily fines of $500 for unauthorized infrastructure expansion. It quoted obscure passages from the HOA charter I'd never even heard of. I wasn't rattled. I had a full permit packet from the city, signed off by zoning, fire, and environmental. This wasn't my first project. I'd built a guest house back in my old neighborhood. But I was annoyed, and I knew something that Gloria didn't. I had a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, either. My sister, Vanessa. Municipal code was her specialty, and she'd spent the last decade suing cities over unlawful ordinances. I sent her a photo of the letter and followed it with a short voicemail. Gloria's poking the bear. By noon, I had a response drafted. Vanessa's letter was a thing of beauty, calm, precise, and lethal. It dismantled the HOA's claims point by point, cited state law, and ended with a gentle reminder that any interference with legally permitted construction could result in damages, both civil and punitive. I printed it out and hand-delivered it to the HOA Dropbox, stapled to the original cease and desist she'd left me. But I didn't stop there. I also called a meeting with my neighbors, just 5 of them, the ones I knew weren't in Gloria's pocket. We met in my garage that evening, surrounded by drill presses and tool chests. Gloria's trying to find me into submission, I told them. But she's not just picking a fight with me. This could happen to any of us. Mara, who lived 2 houses down, crossed her arms. She hit me with a violation last month for having a wind chime, said it created noise pollution. She cited me for using my smoker on my back patio, said Keith, a retired firefighter. Said it was a fire hazard, even though I've got a concrete pad and a hose 10 feet away. She's fishing, I said, looking for ways to control everyone, but if we push back together, she can't isolate us. We agreed to start gathering documentation, letters, warnings, fines. Anything she'd mailed or posted. I volunteered to catalog it. 3 days later, I got my second visit from the HOA, this time not just Gloria. It was a full quorum. Gloria, her vice president Neil, and treasurer Darlene. They stood on my porch like a trio of tax auditors, stiff and sour-faced. "We've received a legal response from your sister," Gloria began without so much as a greeting. "She's my attorney," I corrected. "Not just my sister." "Be that as it may," Neil cut in, "your tone in the letter was unnecessarily hostile. We'd prefer to resolve this amicably." "You mean quietly," I said. Darlene glanced at her clipboard. "The board is willing to suspend the fines temporarily, provided you submit a revised construction plan for review." I stepped outside and let the screen door fall shut behind me. "You want me to revise a plan that's already been approved by the city?" Gloria narrowed her eyes. "HOA approval is a separate process. Only if the HOA's guidelines don't contradict municipal code," I said. "Which in this case they do." Neil cleared his throat. "We're not here to argue legalities." "Then why are you here?" They didn't answer. "You're trying to scare me into backing down," I said. "But I've got every paper trail I need, and if you push this any further, I'll take it to the county." Gloria stiffened. "Are you threatening litigation?" "Not threatening," I said. "Promising." They left without another word. 2 days after that, the real bomb dropped. Keith called me just before dawn. "You need to come see this." Now, I walked 3 houses down in my slippers and found him standing next to a utility box. The front panel had been pried open, wires exposed. A pair of red-handled snips lay in the grass. "Power's out to your construction site," he said. "And only your site." I called the power company. They sent a technician out within the hour. After 15 minutes of checking lines, he came over looking uneasy. "Someone cut your temporary connection," he said. "Deliberately. Cut it, clean slice. Whoever did it knew what they were doing." They didn't just yank wires, they isolated the feed and severed it so it wouldn't trip anything upstream. "Can you reconnect it?" He nodded. "Yeah, but I have to report the tampering." "Please do." As soon as he left, I called Deputy Carson. He came out again, took statements, photographed the damage, and made notes in his logbook. "This isn't HOA business anymore," he said. "This is property sabotage. Can you investigate? I'll file the report and refer it to the county. But to be honest with you, you'd be better off with private surveillance." Already ahead of him. I'd installed 3 motion-sensitive cameras after Gloria's driveway stunt. One caught movement near the utility box around 3 a.m. The footage was grainy, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Short, wide-brimmed hat, and that telltale limp from a botched hip replacement. "Gloria." I sent the footage to Vanessa. By the next afternoon, she filed an emergency injunction with the county court, citing harassment, trespass, and malicious interference with permitted construction. The judge signed it within hours. That evening, a county sheriff's deputy served Gloria at her house. Word spread fast. By nightfall, half the neighborhood knew she'd been hit with a court order banning her from entering my property, contacting my contractors, or interfering with construction in any way. But the real turning point came at the next HOA board meeting. It was held in the community clubhouse, a beige, echo-prone relic from the early '80s. Usually, only a handful of people showed up. This time, the place was packed. Word of Gloria's antics had reached far more residents than she realized. I arrived with a folder full of documentation. The sabotage report, camera footage, the city permits, Vanessa's legal filings, and a list of 10 neighbors who'd experienced similar harassment from the HOA. I waited for the meeting to begin. Gloria opened with a shaky welcome, then tried to dive into landscape compliance reports. I stood up. I moved to add an item to the agenda, I said. A vote of no confidence in the current board's leadership. Gasps, murmurs. Gloria's face turned the color of wet clay. You can't, she started. Robert's rules, I interrupted. Any member can propose a motion from the floor, and I've got supporting documents. Neil looked panicked. Darlene gripped her pen like it was the last thing keeping her grounded. I second the motion, Mara said from the third row. The vote wasn't close. 32-8. The board was dissolved on the spot, pending a special election, and just like that, the storm Gloria had stirred finally blew back in her face. Construction resumed the next day. No more letters, no more gates. Just the sound of hammers and drills and the steady rise of a workshop that symbolized something bigger. A neighborhood done being pushed around, and Gloria, she hasn't been seen outside since. The sawdust hadn't even settled in the new workshop before the first subpoena landed on Gloria Zimmerman's doorstep. It was late morning when I saw the unmarked sedan roll up to her house county seal on the plates. 2 men in blazers stepping out, one holding a thin yellow envelope. They rang the bell, no response. They waited a full minute before posting the document to her door and taking a photo of it in place. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt focused. Because what began as a petty power play had just escalated into something else entirely. The footage from the utility sabotage had been enough to trigger the emergency injunction, but Vanessa hadn't stopped there. She had filed a formal complaint with the district attorney's office, attaching the police report, video evidence, and a documented pattern of harassment from the HOA. They were no longer treating it as a neighborly dispute. They were investigating it as criminal mischief with intent to disrupt lawful operations. And that was just the beginning. 2 days after the subpoena delivery, Deputy Carson returned, this time not to my property, but to Mara's. She called me shortly after he left. They found something, she said, voice low. He wouldn't give details, but he asked if I'd be willing to testify. I didn't ask what about. I already had suspicions. Mara had told me Gloria once entered her backyard uninvited to photograph non-compliant garden fixtures. At the time, Mara hadn't pressed charges. Now, with a formal inquiry underway, the deputy was connecting dots no one had realized were part of the same pattern. Later that week, I got a call from a man named Joel Kessler. He was the county's legal investigator, working under the DA's office. He asked to meet on site to review the workshop and discuss the timeline of events. He arrived the next morning, sharp suit, no nonsense, and carried a leather-bound folder that looked older than both of us. I've reviewed the court filings, he said, stepping into the workshop, but I want to see the location myself. I walked him through the layout. He studied the breaker panel, the trench where the line had been severed, even the location of the motion sensor camera. "Do you know what kind of wire was cut?" he asked. 6-gauge copper. Rated for 200 amps, he nodded. That qualifies as felony property damage under state law. Especially given the risk of electrical hazard. He examined the footage again, this time zooming in frame by frame. "She's not new to this," he said. "The way she avoids the camera directly, the angle of approach, she planned it. You think it was premeditated?" He closed the folder. "I think she's done this before." That evening, I got a knock at my door. It was Keith, holding a battered shoebox. "I've got something," he said. "Didn't think it mattered before, but now." Inside the box were old HOA newsletters dating back 5 years. Most were standard fare reminders about trash bins, lawn height, pet leash policies. But one caught my eye. It was dated 3 years prior, and it outlined a temporary suspension of electrical service to a specific address during a compliance correction. The address wasn't mine. It was a house that had since sold, belonged to an elderly couple who'd moved out suddenly. "You think she cut their power too?" I asked. Keith nodded. "They were building a greenhouse." Gloria said it violated lot coverage limits. A week later, the greenhouse was gone, and so were they. I added the newsletter to the growing pile of documentation. By the following Monday, the county had issued a search warrant. Gloria's house was raided shortly after sunrise. 3 cruisers and an unmarked van rolled in. They knocked once, announced themselves, and went in. I didn't see them haul her out, but I saw the boxes come out: file folders, a desktop computer, 2 external hard drives. Neil and Darlene weren't at the scene, but word spread fast. Within an hour, the HOA's group email list was buzzing. I wasn't on it anymore, but Mara forwarded me the threads. One line stood out from a resident named Sam. "How many other times has she done this?" The next HOA meeting was supposed to be a standard procedural follow-up. Instead, it turned into a community reckoning, held at the elementary school gymnasium to accommodate the sheer number of attendees. It was standing room only. Joel Kessler attended, not as a presenter but as an observer. His presence added weight to the proceedings. Neil opened the meeting, visibly uncomfortable. "Given recent developments, the board will be cooperating fully with the county's investigation." He didn't get to finish. A voice from the crowd cut in. "Why wasn't this stopped sooner?" Neil faltered. "We weren't aware you signed off on her actions," someone else shouted. "You backed her every time." Darlene stood. "We were following her lead. She said everything was by the book." I stepped forward. "Then your book needs rewriting." I handed copies of the city permit, the court order, and the electrical sabotage report to the moderator, who placed them on the presentation table for public viewing. "I'm proposing a full audit of the HOA's actions over the past 5 years, I said. "Not just fines and violations. I want a review of board decisions, communications, and enforcement protocols." There was a murmur of agreement, then applause. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. It grew with every passing second. A vote was called on the spot, unanimous approval. The board would be placed under temporary administrative oversight pending the audit. An interim committee of 5 residents, none of whom had served on the board before, was appointed to manage affairs until the review concluded. As people filed out, I caught Joel at the back of the room. "You think she'll do time?" I asked. He gave a slow nod. "Depends on what we find on those drives, but the sabotage alone is enough for charges, and if we find evidence of financial mismanagement." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The very next week, the county announced formal charges: 2 counts of felony vandalism, 3 counts of criminal trespass, and 1 count of reckless endangerment. Gloria turned herself in. Bail was posted, but the damage was done not to me, but to the fortress she thought she'd built. The day after the charges were announced, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, no signature. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the words, "You should have kept quiet." I handed it to Joel. He didn't even blink. "We'll trace it," he said. "This goes deeper than one angry woman." Sure enough, the audit turned up more: unauthorized purchases, misallocated funds, a landscaping bill for $12,000 that no one could verify, a security consultant hired to monitor compliance who turned out to be Gloria's nephew, and a series of unapproved fines levied on homes that had since sold, with no record of where the money went. The DA expanded the investigation. Neil and Darlene both resigned within a week. Neither was charged, but both were barred from holding HOA positions for life. The new committee passed a resolution capping the HOA president's authority, requiring board votes for all enforcement actions, and creating a permanent resident oversight panel. No more secret fines. No more surprise compliance visits. No more unchecked power, and my workshop. It stood finished, humming with light and purpose. For the first time in months, the neighborhood was quiet, not with fear, with peace. 3 weeks after the charges against Gloria hit the local paper, the last of her influence in the neighborhood crumbled like wet cardboard. Her name was scrubbed from the HOA website. The community Facebook group, once tightly controlled by her allies, was now moderated by a rotating panel of residents. Even the old meeting minutes, some handwritten, some typed, were scanned and uploaded for public record. It was like someone had pulled the curtain off a stage and everyone finally saw the wires, the puppets, and the scripts. One morning, I found a small envelope taped to my workshop door. Inside was a thumb drive, unlabeled, no note, no markings. I took it straight to Vanessa. She ran a scan on her laptop, then opened the files. There were audio recordings, dozens of them. "Looks like she was recording board meetings, secret ones," Vanessa said, "and some of these don't sound like meetings at all." We listened. The first few were innocuous, just the usual HOA chatter. But then came one where Gloria's voice was unmistakable. She was instructing Neil and Darlene on how to issue fines under fabricated pretexts, suggesting reasons like unapproved mailbox paint or unregistered porch furniture. Another file had her discussing how to cite non-existent regulations without ever sending the actual rulebook because, in her words, most people are too lazy or scared to check. She laughed. The others laughed with her. Vanessa leaned back. "This is bad. This goes beyond HOA overreach. This is systemic fraud under color of authority." I forwarded the recordings to Joel Kessler. Within 24 hours, subpoenas were issued to both Neil and Darlene again, not for their previous roles, but for their involvement in the recordings. Joel updated me that the audio would be submitted as evidence in Gloria's pending trial. That same week, the new interim committee invited me to a closed review session. They were short one person after a volunteer stepped down unexpectedly, and they needed someone with first-hand documentation of the misconduct. I accepted, not for the title, but because I wanted to see it buried for good. At the session, we reviewed incident logs from the last 4 years. One entry stood out. A complaint filed by a resident whose home had been foreclosed on after a series of escalating fines. The total came to nearly $20,000, none of which had been authorized through proper legal channels. The homeowner, a widowed veteran named Mr. Redford, had tried to fight it. His appeals were ignored. He'd moved out quietly and now lived in a small apartment across town. I drove there myself. When he opened the door, he looked surprised, wary, even. I introduced myself and explained why I was there. "I warned people," he said, finally letting me in. "Told them the math didn't add up." But no one wanted to rock the boat. He handed me a file folder from a cardboard box in his closet. Inside were copies of every violation, every check he'd written, and the notice of foreclosure. The letterhead on that final notice, not from a bank or a court, it was from the HOA itself. Vanessa looked through it and shook her head. "They used manufactured debt to seize his house. That's not just unethical, that's criminal fraud and possibly grand larceny." We turned it over to the DA's office the next morning. Joel called me personally 2 days later. "This changes things," he said. "We're filing additional charges. Gloria's looking at potential racketeering." A week later, a second arrest warrant was issued. This time, it wasn't just for Gloria. Neil was picked up at his home. Darlene turned herself in the following evening. Both were charged with conspiracy to defraud and abuse of fiduciary duty. Gloria's charges were expanded to include unlawful seizure of property and intent to defraud a protected class. Mr. Redford's veteran status made it a federal matter. The trial was scheduled for early fall. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was changing. The new committee passed a comprehensive reform package: no more secret meetings, no more fines without a paper trail. All HOA funds were now managed by a third-party accounting firm. A resident Bill of Rights was adopted, and monthly open forums were established. I didn't run for permanent board membership, but I stayed on as an advisor until the new leadership was voted in. Mara got a seat, so did Keith. And a quiet couple from the corner lot, who had never spoken at a single meeting before now. The day of the trial, I sat in the third row of the county courthouse. Gloria wore a navy blue blazer and kept her eyes down while the charges were read. Neil looked stunned, like he still didn't understand how this had all unraveled. Darlene cried once when the audio recordings were played aloud. Mr. Redford testified. So did I. So did Mara and 3 other residents who'd been targeted over the years. The judge didn't need long. Gloria was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 2. Neil and Darlene received suspended sentences and community service, along with a lifetime ban from serving in any residential governance role. Restitution was ordered, totaling over $60,000 in improperly issued fines and fees. Mr. Redford's foreclosure was overturned, and his home was returned to him by court order. I stood with him when he walked back through the front door of his old house. He didn't say much. Just ran his hand over the doorframe and nodded. The workshop was finished now. Fully operational, humming with new projects, but that wasn't the real victory. The real win was the transformation of the neighborhood from a place ruled by fear and manipulation to one where people finally spoke up, stood together, and rebuilt the rules from the ground up. One evening, Mara stopped by with a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. "You think we'll ever see someone like her again?" she asked. "If we do," I said, pouring us each a drink, "we'll know exactly what to do." We sat on the back porch, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. For the first time since I'd moved in, it felt like home.